Morning, church. How are we today? Good. Well, before I preach, Brian asked me to do an announcement about youth. He's very keen on integrating youth with the church. So I'm going to do my announcement. Well, we've been sort of picking up again. Finally, after coronavirus, we've been able to get back and finally gather together, which has been just amazing. So we've got a regular amount of people coming to our service, but some really amazing news from down at Southside. For those of you who don't know, we also have a youth group down at Southside, which started up at the same time. And they've just had an amazing increase of people coming. So Lai works in one of the guy who partners with his wife and runs it down there, he works at one of the schools there. And they've managed to get 27 kids come in last week, which was just amazing. From like 0 kids to 27 kids. So if you could pray for them, because right now their problem is that they need more leaders. They've got 3 leaders at the moment, and it's just not enough to deal with these 27, people coming. And it looks like even more are going to start coming. It's just sort of like a cascading effect now. So if you can keep them in your prayers, keep us in your prayers as well. Don't keep them all for them, but if you can keep them in your prayers, and if you know anyone down on the south side who's maybe in the south side congregation who you think might be, you might want to prompt them to share of their time on a Friday night, just to be, a presence down there, that would be a really great help for them. Cool. Well, that's my announcement over. Let's get into the message. So this morning, I wanted to talk, and I wanted to just my whole message is just going to be about glorifying Jesus, because I think when we read the Gospels, there's a lot we can get about Jesus, but if we don't read it with the context of Israel's scriptures, with the Old Testament, we actually miss so much of what Jesus is and what he did. So today I want to go through 5 of the things about Jesus that he fulfills through the Old Testament. Some of the things, might be a bit more obvious, like the Messiahship, but there's some other deeper things that you have to look at the Israel scriptures to fully understand it and grasp. Cool. So the first one, the obvious one, Jesus was the Messiah. Now you might notice in the New Testament, when you read the New Testament, that Jesus actually doesn't often publicly affirm his Messiahship. Have you noticed that? That he often doesn't actually claim to be the Messiah. In fact, when he does, it's normally just to his disciples. He asks them, "Who do you think I am?" And, Peter responds, "The Messiah," and he says, "Don't tell anyone." So he keeps it a bit quiet. And I wondered why this was. In fact, in Mark, actually, it's only at the very end of Jesus' life, when he's on trial, that he publicly affirms that he is the Messiah. Now, to understand this, we have to look at how Israel expected the Messiah to be, because we're pretty fortunate. We have 2,000 years of theologians, and also we can look at Jesus, and we've sort of seen now what the Messiah is supposed to be. We expect him to be like Jesus, right? But that's not what the Israelites expected. See, the Israelites thought that the Messiah was, he was going to be from the line of Judah, he was going to be from the line of David, he was going to be this warrior king, right? And he was going to bring this, he was going to establish Jerusalem back as a nation again, establish Israel as an independent nation. He was going to fight off the oppressors, and then he was going to establish the Davidic throne. I've just undone my shoelace by stepping on it. He was going to establish the Davidic throne in Jerusalem. And the end goal was that all nations would come and see this kingdom, and they would see that they are loyal to the covenant with Yahweh, and they would go, "This kingdom is amazing. We need to go and learn about their God." Right? So that was what they thought this warrior king, this Messiah would be. And we see this sort of in the time of King David and King Solomon. We see a glimpse of this kingdom, right? We see when Solomon builds the temple and the nation's flourishing and Israel is obeying the covenant. Then all the nations around them come to pay homage, and they go, "We want to learn about your God. How is it that you're so blessed? Your kingdom is prospering." And that's that vision that they were expecting. But our Jesus was quite different to that. He didn't come with military might and military power. And his kingdom wasn't like the kingdoms that we expect on earth. In fact, he was from the line of Judah and from the line of David, as we see in Matthew, but the thing that he was fulfilling was a lot deeper. And we have to go back to Genesis chapter 3, verse 15, which I have bookmarked here. And if you're familiar with your Bible, you'll know that this is just after Adam and Eve have sinned. And God is speaking to the serpent who tricked Eve into eating from the fruit. And he's giving this prophetic promise to the serpent. He says, "Cursed are you above all livestock and all wild animals. You will crawl on your belly and you will eat dust all the days of your life. And I will put enmity between you and the woman, between your offspring and hers. He will crush your head and you will strike his heel." So we get this vision that one day, God's saying, one day a seed of Eve, a descendant of Eve, is going to crush your head under his foot and you're going to bite his heel. And this is what Jesus was fulfilling when he died on the cross. It was more than just, about dealing with the oppressing nations. In fact, Jesus actually didn't do much to deal with any of the oppressing nations. I mean, Israel was completely under Roman control in Jesus' time, and Jesus didn't concern himself with that. His kingdom was not of this world. It was not about coming in an awesome display of power and might and defeating the oppressors. He was defeating an oppressor, but it wasn't the physical oppressor. It was the spiritual oppressor. It was the enemy. And when he died on the cross, it wasn't through an act of amazing power and might that he conquered, that he displayed his messiahship. It was actually, as I said before, the moment that he admitted his messiahship to the public was the moment that he was about to go and die. He's saying, "This is it. I am the Messiah, and this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to offer up my life. And in so doing, I'm not only going to defeat the enemy, but I'm also going to defeat the oppression of sin and death." Powerful stuff. It's so much deeper. And we might already know that because, we've had these 2,000 years of sort of privileged theology that we can look at. But to them, this would have been astounding. This is why Jesus was so careful when he talked about his messiahship, because the messiahship language was so loaded in Israel. They expected something completely different. So he was Messiah. The second thing that he was also true servant Israel. He was true servant Israel. What does that mean? Well, to understand this, we have to look at what Israel was intended to be, right? We have to go back to Abraham and Sarah and the promises that God gave them. See, Israel was meant to be God's chosen nation, his chosen people, in order to bring salvation to the world, right? So they were meant to partner with him in a covenant with him. We see this covenant come into place when God brings them out of Egypt, takes them through the desert, and teaches them what it means to be his people. And at Mount Sinai, he creates a covenant and gives them a law. It's called the Torah. He gives them this law and he says, "I want you to be my people, and through you, I'm going to save the world. I'm going to change the world. My presence will dwell among you guys, and you will be a nation of priests." But the trick was that they had to obey their covenant. They had to be faithful to this covenant with God. And if they weren't faithful, we see that there was actually going to be repercussions. There was going to be covenant curses. But if they were faithful to that, if they were true servants to God, then, and whenever we see them be truly faithful to God in the future with King David and King Solomon, we see that prophetic vision of Israel being a servant nation where all nations come and flock to them. But unfortunately, if we know our Bibles, Israel doesn't quite live up to that covenant a lot of the time. We see a few high points where they do, but a lot of the time, they're quite unfaithful to the covenant. They go and worship other gods, they worship idols, and they completely forget the covenant with their God. And after King Solomon, there's about a 400-year period where it pretty much just starts going straight downhill. Those depressing books, 1 and 2 Kings, where you read, this king came and then he did evil in the eyes of the Lord and then he died. And then this king came and he did evil in the eyes of the Lord and he was even worse than the guy before him and then he died, etc., etc. And we get these prophets going, guys, you need to honor the covenant with God. You're going down a path that's going to lead you to exile, both physical exile from God and spiritual exile. You're going to be removed from your standing with God if you continue down this path. You need to return to the covenant. You need to return to worshiping God. But inevitably, they do go into exile. And even when they return from exile, it's almost as if there's still this spiritual exile there. And we see these prophecies from people like Isaiah. And he says, you're going to go into exile. There's nothing you can do about it now, but there is this hope. This suffering servant is going to come along. And he's going to bear the penalty for your covenant unfaithfulness. One day in the future, he's going to live a righteous life. He'll be blameless. Before he even has finished eating his curds and whey while he's still young, he'll know the difference between right and wrong. And he's not going to fail where you failed. He's going to be the true servant. And this is exactly what Jesus did. He took up Israel's story into himself. He was true servant Israel. He went and did what Israel couldn't. He lived according to God's covenant. He lived blamelessly. And he was able to fulfill Israel's calling. He was able to fulfill that. So he was Messiah. He was true servant Israel. Third thing, he was the Son of Man. Has anyone heard the Son of Man before? Has anyone read that in the Bible before? Yep. David has. Thank you, David. Yes, thank you. I see that. I see your hands. Now, I remember when I first read the Son of Man, I found it a bit of a confusing title because I thought, why is Jesus calling himself the Son of Man? That's a low title, isn't it? I mean, wouldn't you just call yourself the Son of God? That sounds a bit more prestigious, in my opinion. I think the Son of Man is sort of limiting yourself to humanity, right? It's not quite as powerful as I thought his name would be. But it's actually the title that he most uses when he talks about himself. It's his biggest self-designated title. He always calls himself the Son of Man. And to understand this, we have to go back to a book in the Old Testament called Daniel. And it's in Daniel chapter 7 that we're first introduced to this figure, the Son of Man. And I'm not going to read it because it's quite a long account, it's confusing, but I'm going to paraphrase it for you guys. He has this vision. Daniel has this vision one day. And in this vision, he sees these 4 disgusting, horrible beasts rise up out of the sea. And they're violent, they're chaotic, and each one is worse than the last. But at the end of it, he sees one like a son of man. Now, the Son of Man thing just means human, right? But he sees one like a Son of Man who is vindicated above all the beasts, who destroys the beasts, and then is raised up to the right hand of God. But not only is he raised up to the right hand of God, he's also worshipped by all creation as God. So he's this human figure who defeats the beasts, defeats these amalgamations of creatures that represent the nations, and we then see him vindicated to the right hand of God and worshipped as God. So we've got this figure who's both fully man and is yet being worshipped as fully God as well. So we're introduced to this character, the Son of Man. So now when we hear the Son of Man in the New Testament, it starts to make sense. We see Jesus is actually affirming that he is this prophetic figure. He is the figure, the Son of Man that Daniel saw in his vision. And we see this amazing moment when he's on trial with the high priests in Mark chapter 14, verse 50 something. Chapter 53, there we go. Verse 53. It's not 53, it's 61. I'm looking at it now. Here we go. We got there in the end. All right, so this is where Jesus is on trial. He's been taken captive and is standing in front of the high priest of Israel. Now, something I want to note quickly before this. So with the whole the beasts analogy, right? There's this thing in the Bible where evil cities that are in rebellion against God, where they go their own way, they're identified as Babylon. So Babylon is sort of the archetype, which is a big word, the archetype of a city that is in rebellion against God. So if a nation decides to go its own way, forsake God, and set themselves up as God, then they become like Babylon. And so these beasts are associated with nations in this vision of Daniel. They're associated with nations that have completely abandoned God. They've become wicked, they've become callous, they've become violent, and they've completely set up their own lordship. They've forgotten God and put him to the side. And so to associate a nation with these beasts is to say you've completely forgotten God. So we see this trial with Jesus. And the high priest asks him a few questions. And it says here in chapter 61, but Jesus remained silent and gave no answer. Again, the high priest asked him, "Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One?" Jesus replied, "I am. And truly I tell you, you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven." So not only is this the first time that he publicly affirms, I am the Messiah, but it's also the point in time where he's going, this is where that vision that Daniel had, that Son of Man being vindicated over the beasts, this is where it's coming to fulfillment. And not only that, the high priest reacts by tearing his clothes. And I can tell you this, the high priest would have been very familiar with his scriptures. He may not have been very good at following them, but he was very familiar with his scriptures. And what Jesus is doing in this moment is he's associating the moment that he is being vindicated over the beasts with the moment that he is face to face with his high priest. He is saying that this high priest has become like one of the beasts, one of the horns on the heads of the beasts in those visions. He's become, the spiritual leaders of Israel have become like the nation of Babylon. They've completely lost sight of what it is to know God. In fact, they're about to kill God. They're about to put him to death. That's how lost they were. And that is a powerful thing. You can imagine as the high priest hearing that, you get pretty annoyed. You'd probably tear your clothes and go, this man needs to die. So Jesus was the Son of Man. He was both fully God and fully man. And he's sitting at the right hand of God. And he's to be worshipped by all creation. So those are the first three. The fourth one, he is also Yahweh among us. He is Yahweh among us. Now, what do I mean by this? Well, if we look at some of our Gospels, we see some interesting things. First of all, does anyone remember what Yahweh's self-designated name was back in the Old Testament? When Moses asked him who he was, does anyone remember what he said? I am. Oh, there we go, Carla. Well done. He says, I am that I am. So he's known as the great I am. And Israel knows this. Israel knows that the I am is God. So he is the great I am. Well, in John's Gospel, we see some interesting things happen. We see actually that 14 different times Jesus refers to himself as the I am. The first 7 times, or 7 of the times, he refers to himself as I am and then puts some type of description after it. For instance, I am the bread of life in chapter 6, verse 35. I am the light of the world, chapter 8, verse 12. I am the gate for the sheep. I am the good shepherd. I am the resurrection. I am the way, the truth, and the life. And I am the true vine. And we also see 7 other times where he just simply responds with I am. For example, in when he's responding to the Pharisees concerning, I don't need that one, that's all right. Concerning, they were talking about Abraham, and he says, very truly I tell you, before Abraham was, I am. And what is their reaction? They pick up stones to stone him because they realize what he's saying. They're realizing that he's associating that name, the I am, with himself. He is saying, I am the I am. It's powerful stuff. And this all culminates when he says it one last time for the 15th time. And it's right at the time in the Garden of Gethsemane where he's about to be arrested. And we see this interesting thing, which I didn't actually bookmark this, but I'm going to read it anyway because the soldiers' reactions to this is really, really telling. So he's in the garden in chapter 18, verse 5. Okay, here we go. So we'll start at chapter 4. Jesus, knowing all that was going to happen to him, went out and asked them. This is where the soldiers have come up to him and they're trying to find out who Jesus is. He says, who is it that you want? Jesus of Nazareth, they replied. I am he, Jesus replied. But then, this is what the description of what the soldiers did afterwards. When Jesus said, I am he, they drew back and fell to the ground. They drew back and fell to the ground. Why would they draw back and fall to the ground? It's because they're recognizing in this moment that Jesus is referring to himself as Yahweh. He is saying, I am. And they recognize the connotations of that. They fall back to the ground and go, this man is something else. And I think John was very careful to put that in there. He's very carefully structured this to show that Jesus is not just a Messiah. He's not just another prophet. He is, in fact, Yahweh among us. He is the I am. But more than just this, we see Jesus do some incredible stuff. We see him display some incredible authority. First of all, we see his authority over sickness. We see him restore sight to the blind, hearing to the deaf, We see him heal leprosy. Now, leprosy was actually so severe in the ancient times that it was considered, if you were to try and heal it, it was to be like raising someone from the dead. It was physically impossible to heal someone from leprosy. In fact, it was said that only Yahweh could heal the lepers. Only Yahweh could do these things. And what does Jesus do? He goes around and he demonstrates his authority over sickness, over leprosy. He completely heals everyone who comes to him. Powerful stuff. More than that, he's also got authority. So authority over sickness. He's also got authority over sin. We see him actively going about and telling people their sins are forgiven. And we see the Pharisees get riled up about this because they go, hey, you haven't got the authority to forgive sins. Only God can do that. You can't forgive sins. And yet Jesus claimed the authority to forgive people's sins. So he's claiming the authority of Yahweh here. So far he's got authority over sickness and authority over sin. Both things that only Yahweh, only God has authority to do. He also has authority over creation. And we see this authority over the natural world. We see this in that famous story of Jesus in the boat with his disciples. And his disciples are rowing him along or sailing along. And he's asleep on a cushion at the front, and a massive storm blows up and starts, rocking the boat. Big waves come in, and the disciples are fearing for their life. And so they wake Jesus up and said, "What do we do? Lord, what do we do?" And Jesus stands up and he commands the winds and the waves to be silent, to be still, and they obey him. Now, the disciples' reaction here as well is really interesting because it says that they were terrified. They were terrified and asked, "Who is this man? Even the wind and the waves obey him." Who is this man? You can imagine the disciples. They were following this teacher, this rabbi, this guy that they thought was pretty cool, right? And they thought he was doing some pretty cool stuff. But then they have a moment in the boat where where their rabbi, their teacher, stands up and commands the winds and the waves to be quiet. And they know that there's only one person that has the authority to command the wind and the waves, and that is Yahweh himself. So you can understand it would be a terrifying moment for you. If you're thinking you're following this random teacher, well, not a random teacher, but you're thinking you're following this teacher, this prophet, and suddenly he does something that only Yahweh is allowed to do, which is control nature, control the wind and the waves. So authority over sickness, sin, creation, and now he also displays his authority over the demonic. Have you noticed in the Bible, whenever Jesus encounters someone who's demon-possessed, there's never a power struggle involved. There's never this back and forth between Jesus and the demonic. It's always the demonic run and fall at his feet and beg for mercy. Never is there a contest involved. In fact, one of the first things we see Jesus do in Mark is that he goes into the synagogue in Capernaum, in Peter's hometown. He goes in there, and in the synagogue, now a thing about the synagogue I should mention is that the synagogue was meant to be a place of purity, right? So to get into the synagogue, you were supposed to be made ritually pure. Okay, so there's that to note about it. And yet, in this synagogue, we find out that there is a man who has a demon inside him, which doesn't quite seem right. And this is in the presence of people reading out the Torah every day. The scribes and the Pharisees have been reading out from the prophets, reading out from the Torah, and yet still in their midst, there is a demon-possessed man sitting in the back. And now, Jesus comes along. So you can imagine being this demon-possessed man one day. You're sitting there, and you've heard the scriptures over and over. It's not having much effect on you. You think, maybe I'll just doze off. And then suddenly you hear something. You hear a man's voice. And it's a voice that you recognize. And you recognize that it's the voice that cast you out of heaven. And what can you do but run and fall at his feet and beg for mercy? He goes, "What do you want with us? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." And Jesus says, "Be quiet, come out of him." And the demon has to obey straight out of him like that. We also see it when he encounters the man who calls himself Legion. That famous scene where we're introduced to this guy who's got so many demons in him that he can't be contained. He wanders around, clawing at himself, crying out. He can't be contained by any types of chains. He just breaks them. And he sees Jesus approaching in a boat, and the demons go, oh my goodness, this is the Holy One. This is Yahweh himself. What can we do but run and beg for mercy at his feet? And they do that. They run and they fall at Jesus' feet and say, please, don't send us into the abyss. Don't send us into the abyss. Only Yahweh has the authority over the demonic. No man could have commanded that. Only Yahweh, only God. So Jesus is Yahweh among us. He's the Son of Man. He's true servant Israel. And he's the Messiah. And then finally, he's also the Lord returning in power to his temple. He's the Lord returning in power to his temple. What do we mean by this? Well, we talked about the exile of Israel earlier when they were exiled into Babylon. And we talked about how they were in Babylon. Well, I didn't mention how long they were in Babylon, but they were in physical exile for about 70 years before they were able to come back to the promised land, come back to Israel. And when they returned to Israel, they set about trying to rebuild Jerusalem and also to rebuild the temple. If anyone tuned in during the whole isolation phase where I preached about the Spirit of the Lord returning, I talked a little bit about the whole fact that the temple was the resting place of God's presence. And I showed how God's presence first came and dwelt among the Israelites in the tabernacle, and we saw wind and fire, and we saw an amazing display of power as he entered the most holy of holy places in the tabernacle. And we saw that he was separated from people because his presence was dangerous. And we saw that again in the temple which Solomon built, the temple of the Lord. We see the Spirit of the Lord descending in power on the temple again. And again, there's that separation factor. But when they go back from exile in Babylon, they rebuild the temple, and the Spirit of the Lord doesn't return. There's no more fire and wind. There's no more display of power as he comes to his temple. He just doesn't return. And so you can imagine being the Israelites, this is a scary thing. They are defined by their relationship with God. They're defined by God's presence dwelling among them, and yet he's not dwelling among them anymore. More than just this, we get the prophet Malachi who actually addresses the issue. He says, well, do you know why he's not coming back? It's because you guys are still not faithful to your covenant with him. You're still missing the mark. You're still actually not ready for his presence to return to you. But he promises this. He says, one day there will be, the presence of the Lord will return in power suddenly to his temple. And he's going to send Elijah, the prophet Elijah, as a forerunner to prepare you because you are not ready at this point in time. He also says that there is going to be a period of time where the Spirit stops speaking to them. And for the next 400 years, in what's known as the intertestamental period, if you came to my first week of my Mark study, we looked at the intertestamental period, that 400-year gap between the Old Testament and the New Testament. And the reason there was no text in there was because the Spirit of the Lord stopped speaking to Israel. There were no more prophets to speak, no more prophets to write. And you can imagine for a people group defined by this relationship with God, the Spirit of the Lord has stopped speaking to them, and the Spirit of the Lord hasn't returned in power to their temple yet. And then one day, 400 years later, whispers start to emerge of a man who appeared in the desert. And this man wore camel skin like the old prophets, like Elijah. And he was preaching in power and baptizing in power and preaching repentance. He said, prepare the way for the Lord. Make straight paths for him, just as Malachi said. And you can imagine the rumors start spreading around. After 400 years, the prophets have returned. And it says in the Bible that all of Judea and all of Jerusalem and the surrounding countryside go out to see this man, which is understandable if you think, that they've had this 400-year period of no prophets. They all go out to see him, and he's preparing the way for someone who's coming. Who was that was coming? It was Jesus, the Lord returning in power to his temple. But this time when he returned, he didn't return to a singular temple. He didn't return to one place on earth. Instead, when he died, he gave up his Spirit and made it so that we could have free access to his presence, just like I said last time. He made it so that this time the presence of the Lord wasn't dwelling in one physical temple, it was dwelling in the living temple of his people, in each and every one of us. So there's some amazing depths, guys, to the man of Jesus. There's a lot more that we could talk about, but we have run out of my time to speak, I think. So I'm going to get the band to come up. If there is there's only two of you. we'll get you to come up anyway and do some nice stuff in the background. And if we could all just stand, because I think it would be foolish of me to talk all about Jesus and not offer us a chance to get to know him a bit better. If we could all stand and bow our heads as the band starts playing away in the background. And if you're here this morning and you've maybe drifted away from Jesus a bit, or maybe you've sort of once in your lifetime before you maybe sort of committed to following Jesus, but you've strayed off, or maybe you've never actually committed to ever knowing this God, this Jesus that you've heard about. Maybe you want to know more about him. I'm going to ask you, as everyone closes their eyes and bows their heads, if that's you this morning, why don't you just make a decision? Put your hand up. Show me that this is you. You want to make a decision this morning. It doesn't have to be a big public display. This is just between you and God. There's no pressure. There's no fear. There's no condemnation in God. Just like my mum said, all shame disappears in the presence of Jesus. All guilt disappears. When he offered up his life, he offered up his righteousness to us. Now, those who are in Christ Jesus, there is no condemnation. His righteousness covers our sin completely. So let's pray. Dear Jesus, thank you so much that you are so good to us. Thank you that you gave up your life for us on that cross. Thank you that you saw fit to step out of heaven and not with mighty power and a mighty army deliver us, but with humble servants, a servant action of offering up your life on the cross. You paid that price for us, Jesus. You made it so that we could have free access to your presence. Now the Spirit of the Lord dwells in us. We thank you, Jesus. If you'd like prayer for anything, I invite you to come up the front. The band's going to play. Other than that, we're going to sing one last song. Join us for tea and coffee outside. If there's anything that you have need of or anything that you need prayer for, stay a while, worship with us, and so we'll come and pray with you as well. Thank you, guys.